Okay, Peter, walk us through some of the main points that you see having been made over the last couple of days. Obviously, the big conversation surrounds the potential of war between Russia and Ukraine, but there are bigger issues at stake as well.
Well, indeed. I mean, the public stage is very much taken by Ukraine, and everybody talks about Ukraine, and even in the bilateral relation, everybody talks first about Ukraine, is sometimes surprised to know that ICRC has been there for the last 7-8 years, has been actively responding to people suffering from the impact of war, which has been ongoing despite all the ceasefire arrangements.
And despite the fact that the international media seems to have caught on to the fact that this has been a story for a long time now.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, in my contacts here, of course, there is the world out there and many humanitarian crises which are certainly very serious because they are life-threatening to many people. Afghanistan comes to mind first and foremost. We are in a very serious situation with regard to the humanitarian impact of the post-conflict situation in Afghanistan. Now it's difficult because the system has crumbled, and it's very difficult without a full-fledged banking, financial and economic and social sector to really deliver humanitarian aid. And despite the fact that it is difficult, I think we managed to create and maintain a new dynamic in responding in particular to some of the very critical issues in Afghanistan. But it is important because there are political blockages which prevent a more generous aid to Afghanistan, and therefore this forum is important also to articulate it with political decision makers.
No doubt about it.
The Sahel is a region of big concern. I have been there in particular in Niger over the last week, and it remains a very volatile situation. We see food security in the Sahel as probably the most important upcoming issue in 2022. I think that what we see at the present moment is that all indicators from Somalia to Mauritania are going in the wrong direction with regard to food security of people. And the political dynamics are difficult, access is difficult, it's still war and violence going on between armed forces and different types of jihadi groups, Islamic State-based, Al-Qaeda-based, other Islamic groups in the Sahel. So it's a difficult situation where we have violence, climate change, food security issues combining themselves to a very fragile and difficult situation.
Speaking of fragile and difficult situations, you mentioned at the top of the program Ukraine and having operated in that area for a long time now, since 2014. So that would give you a great deal of familiarity with what's really going on. How are you able to assist those here in Munich, policymakers, when it comes to actually understanding what's really happening on the ground? Because there is a lot of information and potentially misinformation. You've got the US president saying war is imminent, we have a time and a place, multiple times, and yet here we are.
Well, it's very difficult for a humanitarian actor, even on the ground, to make a judgment on the military strategic situation at the present moment in and around Ukraine. But what I can say from my colleagues on the ground, and we have more than 600 people active in Ukraine, 400 plus in eastern Ukraine, that most of our times are basically passed in continuing the life as usual.
Yeah.
We deliver humanitarian services to people because they need these services, and they need them and have not needed them in the last couple of years. So there is a kind of a very strange situation in which the day-to-day life is the same as it was 1, 3, 6 or 12 months ago.
Mm-hmm. And that's in spite of the 100,000+ troops on the border.
Yes, it's just delivering services to people. It's making that the water flows, that sanitation services flows, that hospitals have medicine, that around the contact line, those who are displaced or affected by the day-to-day violence around the contact line have an organization caring for them, and we deliver those services. And then we read the papers and we look at TV and we see that there is a major political, military, strategic discussion ongoing, and this is kind of two realities with which we are confronted today.
Speaking of that displacement, given your situation now, with the access that you have to the kind of information on the ground, what would the displacement picture look like in your view if there were to be an incursion? Are we talking about a crisis, like a massive crisis that perhaps people here aren't even thinking about yet?
Well, look, I don't even want to speculate because whatever population displacements are in the context of war and hostilities in the world, it's rarely foreseeable what it means because there is a real factor, there is a psychological factors, and a lot depends on what exactly is happening. So I'm not going to speculate what it would look like. What I think my message here to political decision makers is, and it would be the same with regard to Ukraine or any other conflict in the world, is that unfortunately in those big conferences and diplomatic contacts, the humanitarian costs of military strategic operations is very often underestimated. Yeah. And that's our main concern. We are concerned when sort of tensions are mounting, because we normally know how it looks like when
it all goes wrong.
When it all goes wrong, and then chain reactions sink in societies, and then it always ends longer than expected, more painful than expected for civilian populations. And this is my real concern wherever in the world we see tensions arising. And the second, of course, I have to say, again, Ukraine is one place out of 35 major operations in which ICRC is active, and probably in 10 of them, we see tensions mounting and problems mounting. And so there is always this discrepancy in attention that we are struggling with.
What about Afghanistan? Because the last time we spoke, this was prior to the withdrawal. What does the Afghan situation look like to you today in terms of the funding? What are the bottlenecks?
I think Afghanistan is an interesting case where we have been there for more than 35 years. And we are confronted with a new reality. Post-war Afghanistan has more serious humanitarian consequences arising in the society than even Afghans had to suffer during the war. Because the war was kind of limited to certain places. Now the economic, social, and financial sort of implosion of Afghanistan as a functioning state is causing and driving political needs. And because of sanctions, because of non-recognition, because of all the blockages and stopping the aid which has come to Afghanistan over the last 20 years, we see a very serious humanitarian situation emerging. And so what we proposed over the last couple of weeks to political decision makers is to ease sanctions for humanitarian purposes, to inject liquidity into the system so that at least the schools, the hospitals, the water and sanitation services, the basic services can be maintained. And this presupposes salary payment, medical payments, all these things at the present moment are precarious and only marginally possible. We do rehabilitate, for instance, 28 hospitals at the present moment. We pay salaries, but it's a very delicate negotiation between the donors on the one side and the Taliban government on the other.
If you are not successful in those efforts, how bad is this going to get?
Well, I think we all know what the main pressure points would look like. You can imagine major population movement out of Afghanistan if the continuation of the lack of services to people is moving another 2-3 months forward. I think we are concerned about the security situation in Afghanistan, maybe violence and unstructured violence again taking the upper hand in the reality of day-to-day lives in Afghanistan. We can imagine an illicit economy taking over when no regular economy is coming to the country, and when no regular functioning systems are coming to the country, and the combination of all the three could be quite devastating for regional stability and even for global stability.
When you think about displacement, where would those folks tend, in your view, to go? They're going to go outside their borders. They're going to go anywhere they can to seek a better life.
Certainly. I mean, they first stop where their families and friends are, and Afghans have seen a global migration pattern over the last 20 years. So I would expect that a further degradation of the economic and social and financial situation of the country will lead to global population movement.
When we think about the challenges, you mentioned that you operate in 35 different theaters with basically equal concerns to the ones that are necessarily in the press right now. What do you see as your deepest concern today about where we're headed? Because I had a conversation yesterday concerning the global pandemic, and Bill Gates, who was ahead of the news, frankly, before we saw COVID-19 really shutting down the world, has said that there is another possibility for the next pandemic. He's in fact writing a book on it. From where you sit, what's the greatest challenge on the horizon?
My biggest problem at the present moment in ICRC's response is the complexity of the problems we are dealing with. It's everything on top of everything else. Mm-hmm. We have basically poverty, violence and conflict, climate change, pandemics, serious governance issues, and all these things happen in a new dynamic. It's not, we can't talk and react anymore to those problems in a distinct way. It's not here a conflict and there a completely different rhythm with regard to the pandemic or climate change. What I have seen in the Sahel is kind of emblematic. You see the sort of loss of productive land, the rainfall patterns changing, people being moved by climate change, conflict being accentuated and exacerbated. And I think it's the combination of all of it which is a problem. And the second, I would say that while many of the past years we have seen many of these conflicts almost happening or unfolding autonomously
in a vacuum,
and in a vacuum, in a quiet corner of their own.
Yes.
We see that today global power competition is increasingly coming on top of all the problems.
Yes.
If I look
the
at
great game.
The great game, it's Ukraine is just an example, but we see that Russia and Western countries are increasingly in confrontational posture in Africa. We see that those global powers have interest in different regions and have diverging interests in different regions. And this is a concern because at the end of the day, neutral and impartial humanitarian work also depends on a minimal consensus of powers.
Yes.
That this work needs to be done. We need to have a license to operate not only from the belligerents on the ground, but also from big powers who see the necessity. And this humanitarian space, the understanding for it certainly has not grown over the past year, but has rather become a more difficult issue to treat with.
Would you say that we're in a Cold War mentality in that sense?
Well, Cold War looks as if we were looking back to something which has been there in the past. I unfortunately think we are looking forward to something we don't know yet.
Yes.
Even if
not two sides, but
not
something
two
much
sides,
more complicated.
But much more complicated, much more difficult to even get your head around, and much more difficult, very frankly, for a neutral and impartial organization to negotiate its pathway and its space in places where people are really in need.
Bless you, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us. Guys,
Thanks
we're
a
going to
lot.
leave it there.